Hello beautiful people, and a warm welcome back to the Surrey Art School studio as we prepare to embark on our last cycle of the season of mycology. Now this cycle is a little bit short and sweet. We are looking at a couple of bracket fungi. I thought it'd be really fun to look at those in December because bracket fungi you can find in and around the woods all year round. So you'll find them growing on birch trees, you'll find them growing on beech trees, and we're looking at two particular bracket fungi. The first one I think you will find fascinating. It's the birch polypore, and this is literally the Swiss Army knife of bracket fungi. It has so many different antibacterial, antimicrobial properties. It is a real healer of the mushrooms, and it is often overlooked, and you will find it, as the title suggests, on birch trees. Now people often think that bracket fungi are damaging to trees, but in fact there's a sort of symbiotic relationship in that they help the wood to break down when the tree is dead. So you will definitely find birch polypore in the woods around you locally, and we'll also be looking at another really beautiful fungi which comes in so many different colours, so many different variations, which is the turkey tail. So some very gentle, mindful exercises around those two mushrooms for you for this last cycle of the season. And just to let you know that because this one is a little bit short and sweet, I have put a pause on your payments just so that we can have a good rest over the winter season as well. So you won't be charged in January for your Patreon subscription, and I will be sending out your paints for the new year in January as well. So just wanted to let you know that. So I hope you enjoy this last little cycle of the season on mycology. I'll be back in January to share some plans about a new theme, and obviously I'll be checking in early in January with your perpetual journal. But for now, I hope you enjoy these last little mindful exercises looking at bracket fungi, which are available all year round. And I really hope you enjoy the resources and the information that accompanies that. Sending so much love. Okay, my loves, so technically people think that the mushroom season is over in the UK in November, but that's not necessarily true. There are a few mushrooms that grow throughout the year, like wood bluets, and you may find oyster mushrooms, and one that you definitely will see, and so I thought I would focus this December tutorial on, is the birch polypore. And in fact, we're going to look at a few different bracket fungi for this cycle, as promised. Now, it's not the most challenging mushroom to draw the birch polypore, but it is really fascinating from a scientific perspective. It has loads of incredible properties that you will see in the resources, including antifungal, which you wouldn't really think, would you, for a mushroom? But it doesn't like to grow around other mushrooms, so for that reason, it has some quite strong antifungal properties. It's also antiviral, antiseptic, and probably one of the best plasters that you could ever make from yourself, way better than a regular plaster that you might get from a shop. Can be made from the underside of the birch polypore. So I thought it was really worth including in our mycology studies. So I wanted to offer a couple of tips on how to sketch the birch polypore on the tree, and then just a little close-up as well. I'm just doing this on paper, but I am going to show you my actual sketchbook pages as well in the resources, so you can see how I've sort of laid out the information. What else did I want to say about birch polypore? Oh yes. So what's interesting, because we've looked at the birch tree before, is that the birch polypore grows out of the lenticels of the birch tree. So it finds a little nook where the hyphae get in and the little spores start to grow, and then it grows from there. And people think that bracket fungi sort of degrade the tree, but that's not necessarily true. They don't actually cause much impact to the tree when it's alive, but when it's dead, they help it to decompose. So I thought it was interesting, this connection between the birch polypore and the lenticels, which we know are sort of like breathing apparatus for the birch tree. So it's a nice little link into some of our previous studies on things like the spirit of trees, when we looked at birch trees for that. So an interesting little link, I thought. So you've got a couple of options for this birch polypore, and also something that sort of, when we know about lenticels, that we also will then know about drawing the polypore fungi, is that you've got to watch where your eye level is with an image. So with this image here, anything above eye level, we're seeing the bottom of the polypore, and then anything below eye level, we're seeing the top. And they tend to start off quite light, and then they get darker as they sort of progress. So we can think about that in terms of our sketching. So if we're just going to do a basic sketch, I would put in the lines first of the outside of the tree. That's nice and simple to do, I know. And then we'll think about materials we might add to them afterwards. So I'm just going to put the main lines in first. And then I will sketch these weird sort of ear-like shapes that we're seeing. They're very, very sort of spongy. You should definitely go out and look and have a look at some, because I have found them just in the woods next to my house, and they are really interesting to observe. So they sort of like grow out of these little lenticels, and sometimes you'll see them on the side like we've got here. So we'll just put our pencil marks in first. And here we start to see a bit of the underside and a little bit of the top. Here we've got one growing out, and we see mostly the bottom of this little polypore shape. And then this one right at the top here, we're seeing just the bottom really. So we want to get something a little bit darker down into our background once we've tidied up our drawing. So I'll just take away the areas where there's a line running through just real quickly with a rubber. And then you've got a couple of options as to how you go about doing your birch tree. This one's quite greyish, this one that I'm looking at. Some of them can be a little bit lighter and brighter. But interestingly, a lot of the bracket fungi you can see throughout the year. So we'll look at turkey tail a little bit later on as well, just for the stunning colours and patterns really, the shapes of the turkey tail. So they're just, like I said, not the biggest sketching challenge in a way, because they are just blobs. They are just little blobbles that come off the tree, but they're so interesting, I think, as a species of fungi, that I thought it would be really good to include them in this cycle about bracket fungi. So there we go, there's my little sketch done. And then a couple of options here in terms of how you add some materials to that. So if you happen to have some shadow violet around, that can be really nice. In fact, I'll do a separate just tree outline just to show you. So with the shadow violet, you get some really nice tones that come out. So if you happen to have it at home, you just lay a little wash down. And obviously you'd be going around your mushrooms here. And my wash is a little bit tinted, which I think is okay. It makes it a bit easier to see on camera. And then I'm just going to get a little bit of shadow violet, just from the tube actually. And I'm just going to drop that straight in and let it sort of split and spread. And it gives you these lovely sort of cool tones, just sort of tickling a little bit some of the wet areas. And you can get some really nice effects for that, sort of the notion of the eyes of these birch. Add a little bit more water to that just to help it move and spread. I'm sort of just adding a very subtle tint to the background of our tree here. This I did in my sketchbook, just as a little way of tinting my tree, but without going too strong with it. Just adding some little tones in there. You might want to drop a little bit of green in as well, that's okay, because you get these sort of cool tones. This is just really fun to do. You get these sort of cool tones, but you also get little hints of moss and little cracks and chasms. So just putting some like little lines in for where the lenticels are, and just a little bit of shadow tone as well, just because we can't just have pure white on white, can we? So just a little something just to tint our little birch tree there. And it's just really effective with the shadow violet if you've got it at home. If you don't, you can use something like Payne's Grey, that will work just as well. And then again, as I said, if you want to drop in some little bits, I've got a little bit of undersea green left on my palette. I'm going to go quite thick with it. I can drop in some just little hints of green around the edges. Just sort of brings the study a little bit more to life. This is just like a little quick study to go into your sketchbook, so it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a little hint, a sense of the spirit of the tree. So just dropping a few little hints of that in, and we'll let that dry, and I can make some suggestions about how we could work over that as well once it's dry. So that's one option for your boggly background for your birch tree, which is quite nice. I think I'll just join up my lines a little bit, but a little bit scraggly there with my lines. And then obviously we'll talk about the polypore in a minute, but also we were working with water-soluble pencil, weren't we, earlier on in the season, and I've got mine here. And what I like to do is sort of get that out first and get it moving. And again, you can do the same thing, just avoiding the polypore themselves from the sketch that you've created. I love a bit of wet on wet. And just chucking in some little hints of grey in there, just to sort of take the page off whiteness. So that can work just as well for that sort of silvery bark on the birch tree. You do love that tinkle, don't you? So I'm just, rather than going straight in with my pencil, I'm just taking a little bit, getting a wash in, and then, went a little bit too strong there, classic, famous last words. And then just tinting my birch tree so you get this nice silvery tone coming through. And because we're working wet on wet, we get nice granulation as well from that, so it really echoes the texture of the tree. Need to remember to stop putting it straight in. Although it's not too bad actually, it does work quite well, even straight in, as long as it's wet on wet. You won't want to go straight in with your graphite pencil here, with your water-soluble pencil. It'd be a little bit too strong, I think. So you can do the same thing. Just like to offer options, because I know we haven't all got the same materials at home. Just tinting that tree, adding some sort of sense of the textures of the bark. And just taking it off the white of the page, so it's a little bit too dark for our purposes, really. Too light for our purposes, sorry. There we go. So a couple of little options on how to tackle that texture of the birch tree. Of course, you can put a little wash behind as well if you want to, like a nice woodlandy wash. Might work quite well here. I'm just going to sort of push up and push down the edges so it's like a little segment. Just a little bit of sense of it continuing beyond the study is actually quite nice, rather than this sort of hard finished shape. So we'll just let those dry, and then we'll work in some materials just to bring those little polypore mushrooms to life, okay? Okay folks, so just a little reminder on neutralising oranges, just to create the very subtle beigey tone for the underside of our little birch polypores. So I'm going to take some red, quite a warm red, and then mix it with yellow to create an orangey tone. And then I'm going to add a little bit of blue to that, just a small amount. Just checking the blue. And that's going to give me quite a neutral, creamy tone. And once I've done that, I'm just going to add a bit more water to it. We've done this before, and that's going to give me a very subtle creamy tone just for the underside of my birch polypores. So it is super subtle. We don't want much of a tint there at all. And I'm just going to add that in to the underside of my little polypores on my tree. Especially this one here. So super, super subtle. And I'll just let that dry. See if that was an underside as well. There we go. And I also thought If you wanted to add some further texture to your birch trees as well, just whilst that's drying, you can always come back in with your with a pencil, water-soluble pencil, and if you just sort of work on the side, you can add a little bit of a more distinct texture to your trees. So I thought that might be a nice little option. You can do it just with a 2 or 3B pencil as well if you want to. But just working on the side allows us to pick up some of the subtler textures. I actually prefer it with this big chunky graphite stick. It just brings that tree forward a little bit, and just not everywhere, you know, just some subtle little extra hints of texture just to lift that little study out. Okay, and again, if it goes too strong, if you're working with a water-soluble pencil, you can always soften it off again with a bit of water, but I quite like that extra little texture. Just sort of brings the study to life a little bit, doesn't it? And then for the top of your birch polypores, we can keep it really, really simple. I'm going to get my burnt umber, which I find a little bit too warm in this palette. I'm going to cool it down with a little bit of just ultramarine blue, I think that is. And that gives me, it's maybe a little bit too dark now, because it is quite warm actually, the birch polypore. There we go, that gives me a really nice tone for the top of my birch polypore. So you can put this in straight on or wet it down first. I prefer to do wet on wet when it comes to this because it's just a little bit subtler. And then just drop in a little bit of pigment, especially at the edges. If you drop that pigment in, and we want to get these little wiggly edges to these birch polypore. That can work really nicely. You get really nice subtle tones. It's a nice satisfying little study. So I'm just going to repeat that across the rest of my little polypores. So fun, aren't they? They're like little fairy steps. And they are really beautiful. I do really recommend going out and in search of these. They are amazing, big, spongy sort of growths, and they are rather beautiful, I think. And just if you read the resources, just the amount of healing properties is just phenomenal. Like, there is so much there in nature already, so much medicine. Oop, a bit too much water there. It's quite hard because they're quite little, the tree's quite big. Just dropping in a little bit of that little brown mix. So very loose, super subtle, but a nice way to sort of capture our birch polypore. Yeah, and as you said, you can always work in with a pastel or something like that if it's feeling a little bit too subtle for you. Just a nice way to sort of capture them on the tree, to think about how they might look. So we can do a little close-up as well, just with a slightly different material, just for your sketchbooks really. So I'm going to sketch that out here, and then just offer up a slightly different material for that one. So I'm working from this image here. And again, I'll just do the edge of the tree, but with that sort of beautiful, weird mound of a mushroomy shape coming in. And you'll see lots of textures on the underside actually, which are quite interesting. The polypore, because the pores are on the underside, and they are just incredible spongy mushrooms, but the medicinal properties are just phenomenal on these mushies. Okay, so for this one, I just thought it'd be fun, just for something a little bit different for your sketchbooks, to pop in a little bit of wax resist. So I'm just using an old candle You can use something a bit more sophisticated if you like. I'm going to put some on the top and on the underside. It's a little bit woo, this process. But for this one, I'm going to do the same thing. Wet down. And you can actually see where the wax resist is when you wet down, which is quite nice. But it just creates some of those, really subtle textures on the birch polypore. And then again, I'm going to load up. I'm going to use some walnut ink here. You could use some burnt umber ink if that's what you've got. Just like the walnut ink, it's a little bit warmer for this. And I'm going to really load up the bottom edge. And just allow that to sort of soften off into the rest. Sometimes you might end up with a little bit too much water, which means it moves a little bit too much, but you can just smush it in with your brush. And just keep working that in. Just a nice quick way to add a study to your sketchbooks. Again, just lifting out if there's a little bit too much moisture. I've just got a little paper towel off camera. And you may want to build up a couple of layers here because this ink will dry quite light. And just building that in. Really satisfying with the wax resist. I love the textures it creates. It creates all these lovely natural highlights. Just working a little bit intuitively here, really. The wax resist is just sitting on the areas where there are highlights on this, so that's really quite nice. And then for the underside, I'm really just going to use what's left on my brush and just sort of water it down as much as possible and just dry brush that in. Try not to touch the other edge. So we don't get any of that watercolour, that ink sort of whispering down. And then maybe just chuck in a couple of little, whilst that's wet, just a couple of little hints of texture. Just using that same ink. Really subtle. Don't get carried away here because we want that underside to be a lot lighter, if possible. Just going to lift it out a little bit here because it has bled in, because I can't help myself but go a bit too close to the edge. So really what you want is like a stain here. So if you've gone too heavy, just lift out with your brush again. Nice and easy. I'm always a fan of being able to take away. So I'm just going to let that dry, and then I might add a few more marks to that once it's dry, okay? Okay, so the only thing I'd really add to this little study, obviously you can wet down the edge again and add in a little bit of background to your tree, add some details to your tree if you want to. That could be really nice. But really, I think just some very delicate line work just across the edges of the mushroom would work really, really nicely. So I'd probably use a rigger brush for that, and not the ink because it's not quite dark enough for what we want to do. But if we do go back to that little brown mix that we had before, that darker brown mix, and maybe add just a little bit more blue to it, then I think that would work really nicely just for adding some very subtle little bits of line work just to the edge of that top of the polypore. So we've got this sort of lines that's sort of running down. Very, very subtle. And you could just add a little bit of mark making to that edge just to sort of show the curvature of the polypore. And I think that would work really, really well just for this little study for your sketchbook. But yeah, as I said, the polypore Not so challenging technically, I suppose, but just a really interesting one, I think, to include in our study of mycology, just bracket fungi in general, just because they're such a different manifestation, aren't they? And they're just not growing from the ground. This sort of symbiotic relationship with the tree, I think, is really, really interesting. And it's amazing how just adding these little subtle marks, this little hint for the eye, can make quite a big difference, actually, to sort of that sense of the curvature of this this little mushroom. So that's my little suggestion just for finishing off that study. We're going to look at something quite different now. We're going to look at turkey tail. So I'm just going to pause and reset, and I'm going to make some suggestions on turkey tail. Turkey tail is quite the opposite. It's actually quite complex. So I'm going to make a suggestion as to how you might want to go about that. A nice little mindful exercise for capturing the turkey tail, and see how you get on with it. Okay? Okay, so as you can see, the turkey tail bracket fungus is very, very different in the way that it looks, in the way that it grows. And there are loads and loads of different variations in terms of colour when it comes to the turkey tail as well. So it's quite a fun one to have a go at, but it is actually quite complex. So my recommendation for the turkey tail is actually to work with a fine liner and to use this as a really sort of mindful exercise. So I've provided loads of different images of turkey tails in the resources, and what I recommend is to just start working these little concentric circles. And you've got to watch out a little bit here, because the turkey tail sort of bows out as it goes. So we're sort of adding to it each time and keeping quite wiggly lines to sort of show this. It's like a shell-like shape, I suppose. But I think that this, especially at this time of the year, could be a very slow, very mindful exercise for you. Something to really focus in the creative energies. It's slowing me down already, I can feel it. So we're just slowly making those shapes a little bit wider and a little bit wider, and curving them round each time. And maybe some lines that you want to thicken a little bit. So you could come along and add a little bit of weight to some of those lines. But I recommend the turkey tail as a sort of mindful drawing exercise. Just really honing in on the one, slowly but surely finding those edges. Obviously, with the turkey tail, the final edge is quite light, which is why I'm recommending that you use a fine liner for this, and make sure that you keep a little bit of irregularity in your lines as you go along. So that's one of mine done, and then I'm just going to keep on going with that exercise, just choosing one at a time. There's one sort of coming off here, and very slowly finding these sort of oyster-like shapes. They are really, really beautiful to draw. And I love the way as they grow, they sort of overlap. So you get all these different little shelves growing. And this, I think, is something really super soothing, super meditative, that you could just sit. I'm going to do a little bit of a frayed edge on this one, because it's the last one. To sit and just keep picking out those edges. I'll just do one more. It's really, really noticing or letting those lines guide you. And following that sort of overall bracket-like shape, and just getting lost in these sort of contour lines. It sort of reminds me a little bit of the centre of a tree as we might draw it. And occasionally you might want a couple of lines that are really close together. that's sort of built up to create almost like a little bit of tone, or like I said, you can thicken. You can thicken the lines on your turkey tail as well. And then maybe like a wider sweeping one as your sort of outside edge on the turkey tail. So just a little doodle really. I'll just zoom you in a bit closer so you can see that. I've played with lots of different ways of drawing these, but I really do think, or painting these as well, but I really do think just that mindful work with a pen is the way to go with the turkey tail. And there is a little illustration on the resources that will inspire you for this. You can also add in sort of extra marks in the opposite direction if you feel called to. And there's also then a further mindful exercise here, which is to add in some colour. So there we go, that's my suggestion for a turkey tail, is just make it into a little moving meditation. And then you can just be very gentle and mindful about the way that you add your colour. And I'll make some suggestions for that as well. Like I said, there are loads of different colours. We'll focus on this one here, which is sort of browns and oranges. And just, have a little bit of fun with this. But yeah, I just thought this would be a really nice grounding thing to do at this time of the year, where everything else gets really busy and frantic, to allow yourself just to get lost in those repetitive lines and patterns, sort of focusing on the space between your lines and just slowly but surely building up a picture of this beautiful bracket fungi. Okay, and I just used a 0.2 for that because it's a little bit easier to control, in case you wanted to know. Okay, so as is always the rule, we start from light, and we start from the lightest tones to the darkest tones. I would keep your furthest edges just white, don't add anything to those. Although you could add a very, 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 very watered down version of the colours that we're going to use. But to begin with, I'm just going to pop in the lightest tones sort of in between, and I'm just using some yellow ochre. But this is really watered down yellow ochre. So I'm just going to go through now mindfully and look at the colours that I've got and just block in. I mean, to be fair, with these light colours, you could probably just block in the whole lot right up until the edge, just on that first layer. So very, very subtle tinting to begin with. And I'll do the same over here, because that just gives me a nice base tone, and I can fill in the other tones from that. And just keeping that frill or that edge super white. Not many people tackle turkey tails, but I thought we'd have a go at them today. Just as a little mindful exercise for this time of the year, really. Thought it would be nice. And keeping that first tone really super subtle. All right, and we'll just let that dry. Okay, so we're going to just keep gradually working our way darker now. So I've got my yellow ochre, and I'm actually just going to add a little bit of burnt umber to that. Burnt sienna. So it's a little bit warmer. Little bit too much. Let's go back to that yellow ochre. There we go. Maybe just take the edge off with a little bit of blue. It's a little bit too strong there. There we go. It's a little bit darker. So I'm just going to keep adding these bands of slightly darker paint. So we're working in glazes here. And again, this is quite a nice mindful exercise to do. Really get lost in the repetition of this little exercise. Just very carefully filling in those little blanks. And you really need to slow down for this. Calls for slowness. But again, it's one of those things which I think sort of gives us a chance to switch off the mind for a minute and really lean in. So I know I've got one band there for sure. And then let's have a look. Maybe another little richer band. Sometimes I sort of alternate on these. Maybe a little richer band here. And then we're going to incorporate some browns into that as well. So this we can do as long as they don't touch. We can keep adding to them. So I'm going to go for my burnt umber from my palette here, which again is, I find far too bright. I'll just bring it into the camera so you can see. Even though it's burnt umber, it's very warm. So let's dull that down a bit with a bit of, there we go, that's better. And I can add that into this area here. So we're slowly building up the pattern. And there are actually some umbery bands a little bit further out as well, so let's add a few of those in. Maybe a little bit too strong. There we go, so just diluting it down a bit so it's not quite as strong. So all this is really is just building up, slowly but surely, a pattern. And you could do this with blues as well. There's sort of bluey and purpley versions. Just something slow and mindful to focus on. The good thing is they're only little patches. They dry quite quickly as well. Okay, and again you could just run very fine lines over some of those darker ones if you wanted to, just to sort of break them up a little bit. And again, if you're finding that white too stark, I actually quite like it. I think it's all right. I might add a little bit of slightly deeper, richer brown just to this farthest edge here. If you're finding that too stark, I think it is about right, to be honest, but you could always add just a very, very watered down amount of that yellow ochre just to take the edge off. So that's my invitation for these turkey tail, is to very slowly and mindfully work your way through those layers and create a little turkey tail study, just gradually working your way from light to dark. See how you get on with that. So I hope you enjoyed that little exercise. Super mindful, very meticulous sort of work where you're sort of paying really close attention to all those different tones. But I think once you sort of repeat that over multiple little turkey tail studies, that will look really, really, really beautiful. So. And again, like I said, you could change it up. You could do more of a purpley, version, or there are loads of different variations of colours and tones in the turkey tail. I just love that formation. I think it's really, really beautiful and a nice one to add to your sketchbook. So I hope you enjoy that, my loves.